Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for our 30 on Thursday webinar, How to Implement SharePoint Taxonomy. Just a little bit about Protiviti before we get started. We provide consulting solutions in finance, technology operations, data analytics, governance, risk, and internal audit for our clients through our network of more than 70 offices in over 20 countries. Our full-service enterprise content management team provides consulting, on-demand support, and training for SharePoint, Office 365, Nintex, Sitecore, Kentico, SQL, and .NET. Our 30 on Thursday webinar series is a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series where we talk all things SharePoint, Office 365, and ECM. Our next webinar will be integrating Salesforce into your SharePoint corporate intranet on September 14th. You can register for this webinar and see our full event schedule on our website, ecm.protiviti.com. Our Protiviti On Demand team provides on-demand support for Office 365, SharePoint, and Nintex. The team can do performance troubleshooting, system health checks, user experience and design, business intelligence, and so much more. If you're interested in a free 1-hour introductory consultation, you can email us at ecm@protiviti.com or you can visit our website to learn more. Today's session is being recorded. You can access the recording of today's session and see all of our past webinar recordings on our YouTube channel. For questions during today's presentation, please use the question window in the GoToMeeting toolbar or live tweet us your questions using the hashtag 30TTaxonomy. We will be saving all the questions until after Josh's presentation today. Today's presenter is Josh Jackson, Solution Architect here at Protiviti, and I am Julia Marple, and I will be moderating today's session. All right, Josh, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Okay, you should be seeing my screen.
Yep, looks good.
All right. So let's get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. As Julia mentioned, my name is Joshua Jackson, and I'm in the Protiviti On-Demand Services team that Julia just mentioned. I'm an account manager, and I also help our clients with taxonomy, information architecture, and really helping get the most out of SharePoint by using it correctly. So on today's agenda, we will be talking about just kind of generally what is taxonomy in the most broadest sense, and kind of I'll be providing some examples to really help you start thinking about it differently. Taxonomy is something that most people don't realize, but it's really everywhere in our daily lives, and it impacts us in ways that we don't think of. Then we'll be discussing how we can translate all of this into SharePoint. I'll be discussing some of the key building blocks of taxonomy and how to best implement that using SharePoint. And then I'll be providing some general guidance on how to do your own taxonomy assessment and implementation on your own. So what is taxonomy? Generally speaking, it's how you define and categorize information. It's how you look for information as well. So if you think about it using the internet, as you browse or you search for things, all of that is directly related to taxonomy. Taxonomy can be formal. So in this sense, it would be something that's highly structured. For example, we all agree on certain abbreviations for states, and that's just so we have a standard means of communicating in a brief term about a specific concept, and everybody knows what we mean when you see certain abbreviations. Or it can be tribal, and this would be something that is specific to a small group. They have their own way of referring to certain things. For example, maybe in the human resources department, they refer to certain forms or benefits or something like that in a very specific term that maybe not everyone else in the company as a whole would use. And it can be multi-tiered, so there can be a lot of layers here, and it can be branching. It can have a lot of different ways that you can go and you can branch out, and we'll get to some examples of that in just a minute. But broadly speaking, you're going from a general concept and trying to narrow it down to the most specific term that you can, so that when you take all of those the terms together, you have a well-defined and easy to understand concept. So one example of this is taxonomy is embedded in all forms of science. Science is literally the process of documenting the world around us, and as part of that, you have to describe it. So when you think about this, how would you describe a black bear or a dog or a cat or any kind of animal? In this example, a black bear, some cute cubs. Most people probably wouldn't jump immediately to Ursus americanus. They would describe the shape of the animal, the size, things like that. But in science, that can be very inconsistent. As you can see here, we have baby black bears and a mama black bear, and obviously, if you describe the one, it doesn't necessarily apply to the other. But if you look at the way that science is kind of broken down, just the kingdom, the animal kingdom, there's a great way of kind of seeing what we're talking about with taxonomy. And if you think about it, this domain here, this could be any kind of information that you would have in your organization. So it can be files, it can be completed forms, it can be empty forms that are waiting, that people access. It can be anything related to that. And the idea here is we're trying to get from the very broad concept of, okay, we have all this information. How do we categorize it, and how do we define it as specifically as possible so that we get the use out of it? Another example is a grocery store. Most people don't think about this, but when you go to a grocery store, there's actually a very well-defined taxonomy. Nobody wants to have a shopping experience like this, where you just go in, there's just bins of mixed food, you have to sift through things to find what you're looking for, maybe the labels are falling off. That just wouldn't be very beneficial for the customers of the store, and it definitely would be a bit of a nightmare to inventory. So when you think about it, I like to ask myself, how are grocery stores organized? And in general, most grocery stores actually have a very similar organization. The locations may be a little bit different, but around the perimeter of a grocery store, you more or less will always have most of the fresh produce, dairy, meats, things like that. And in the center of the grocery store, you'll have frozen foods and canned goods, durable items, things like that. And the reason that most grocery stores are built the same is that they want to make it easy for users to find what they're looking for. And if it's, at least in the U.S., a very consistent layout, then most users will know, okay, if I'm looking for dairy, I'll go somewhere on the outside perimeter instead of meandering through the center lanes. So then another way to make it even easier for people to find what they're looking for is they put labels on things. They categorize and label things. So when you look at an aisle, you now know, okay, if you're looking for peanut butter or something as generic as like baking goods, if you know what you're looking for kind of falls into those general categories, you would know this is the aisle that you want to go down, and then you can kind of quickly get to what you're looking for. And then in general, most grocery stores will again have a vertical taxonomy here. You can see there's a bunch of different products, but they're all very closely related, and you know they're related by where they are and by the labels that you see on in the lanes in the grocery store. So another example, and this has direct kind of tie-ins to SharePoint, is online retail stores. I think most people are used to using them now, and next time you find yourself interacting with one, think to yourself, is this easy or is it difficult to use? How many clicks is it to find what you want? I find it interesting to, anytime I go to a new store, if I know I'm looking for something specific, I see if I can navigate to it and see how long that takes. And while you're in that process of looking for whatever product you were looking for, whether you purchased it or not, did you see anything else along the way that you wanted? It's very difficult for online retail stores to emulate the experience of being in the store, physically in the store, and having those kind of impulse buys. And that's why you'll see things like Amazon and eBay will have the users also purchased or were interested in, and that's kind of their attempt at showing you things that you may be interested in based off of what other people have used. So how does an online retail store work? Does it work solely off of browsing? Does it work solely off of search? Well, obviously it's both. It has to be an experience of starting out at a very general level, so you want a certain product, you know the store you want it from, and then going there, and how you would go about the process of getting down more narrowly just kind of depends on the end user. Some people will want to search, other people will want to browse to it. So you have to provide both options, and taxonomy will help. So how does all of this relate to SharePoint? So within SharePoint, we have a few building blocks. And this is what I was talking about when I was mentioning starting out broadly and getting too specific. We're kind of going the opposite way here, where we have site columns. These are those individual labels that you've come up with that are distinct and are help define the information that you have. And site columns, just a quick note, are indexed for search. So that is a strong tie-in there where just by creating these tags and these descriptors of items, we're actually directly tying it into search and telling SharePoint that these terms are important and we want to use them and we want to present users with these terms. There's also the concept of the term store and managed metadata, and these are kind of higher level concepts that I won't be covering in depth in this webinar. But in general, those are ways to have a formalized taxonomy, something that is kind of, technically it would go into what's called a content type hub, which is a way to kind of broadcast out defined terms and term sets. So that's a way to have your formalized taxonomy that you're able to broadcast out to all of your users. And in there you would be creating these things called content types, which we will be describing. Content types will contain those site columns and provide a lot of benefits in SharePoint if you set them up correctly. And then there are document sets. Document sets are kind of like super content types. You actually add content types that you create into document sets, and you can add site columns as well. And we'll be discussing those in more detail in a little bit. So for site columns, again, this is the most granular level of metadata. This is information about your information. It's how you would describe your content. There are several categories of columns when you go to create a new site column. The most common ones are the text ones, whether it's single line or multiple lines of text. Choice, yes or no, which is more or less of a kind of a switch or a people picker. And then there are some numerical options, currency, as well as calculated values based off of other fields within the list you're in. So those are some of the general categories of your site columns that you'll have. And as I mentioned, those site columns, those are the most granular pieces of metadata. So the next time you're on a retail website, I want you to look at the product page, not the search page. I want you to go directly to a product and take a look at it and see how many pieces of metadata you think you can find. I think the largest that I found was 21 pieces of metadata on one of the larger retail stores. And I find it really interesting to take a look at all of the different options that are out there. Anything from the name of the product to how many pieces a container contains or the color of it. Those are all different pieces of metadata, and it's pretty interesting to take a look at how much information is actually there and how those all kind of interact together. So moving on, we have the concept of content types. Content types, if you think about them generally, there are some very basic ones, such as document or item or event or announcement. These are things that Microsoft has already put in place for you. The document content type is, again, the most basic, one of the most basic that you have. And you'll see on the content type screen, there are several things that are important about content types. One is that you'll be adding in site columns. So here we see all the columns that are associated with the content type. And you can actually add them if you've already gone through and created your content types. You can actually come in here and add the existing content types, or you can create a new one if you need it, and it'll add it directly into these columns. So this is tying in the concept of site columns and that granular definition of metadata into the idea of, okay, we have a document, or it could be a form or a policy or any kind of information, and you've identified that, but you also know that you want some more information about that. So that's where you would add your metadata columns, and again, those will help with search. So as your users start using those terms and tagging them, your search will get better. Users will find the results faster. Along with content types, you actually get some workflows. So there's the ability to go in there and create workflows that are specific to a content type. A good example would be if you have maybe an expense form or something like that, and you wanted it, anytime somebody completed one and submitted it, you wanted it to be routed to your finance department. You could actually add those in at the content type level, and then you have some granular control, but you can also push that out so that a wide audience can use that. You can also set up data retention policies, and this would be under the information management policy settings. And what data retention policies do is they allow you to make sure that you are not over or under retaining documents. Specifically, records is the main use for this. And they allow you to set up rules so that when certain thresholds are met, let's say it was a form that got approved 2 years ago and you only want to retain those forms for 2 years, you can actually automate the process of deleting that form or emailing the owner and telling them that it's their job to delete the item, so that you can really make sure that your SharePoint sites aren't just growing forever and you're not putting yourself at legal risk by over-retaining information or deleting stuff before you can legally get rid of it. Just a quick tip on content types. If you are creating a highly structured SharePoint environment, such as an intranet or a project management site, I always recommend creating new content types based off of the old ones. So I would come in and I would create a new document content type, and I would name it the organization name space document. And what that does is it kind of gives you some buffer. Especially in the Office 365, changes are coming rapidly, and sometimes Microsoft will push out a change that actually impacts a content type. And if you are using that content type, it can have unpredictable results. So if you actually break that inheritance and you start with your own content type, it provides you with a bit of a buffer, and you're actually able to make changes to it. It's strongly recommended that you don't make changes to the actual document-based content type for exactly the reasons I was just speaking of. So some good examples of content types are forms, policies, procedures, and you can actually think of these in several different phases. So as I mentioned, there may be a form that you have that you want users to fill out for expenses. The form itself is one type of document. A actual completed and submitted form is a totally different type of document, and then possibly even like an approved form might be considered an artifact, and that would be considered a totally different type of document. So as documents exist and they move through kind of their natural life cycle, the content type that you would be using for that could potentially change, as well as the metadata that you're capturing about certain documents. Then beyond that, we have the idea of document sets. As I mentioned, document sets are kind of meta content types. They are a content type that houses other content types. I like to say they're super folders. So they are very much like a folder in that they're meant to hold a bunch of different types of documents. You can have one or multiple content types in there. A document set can have site columns. So why this is important is if you're just using folders to organize your information, you actually can't really associate much metadata with those folders. With document sets, you actually can have unlimited, well, minorly limited columns, metadata columns for a document set. And then the documents that you put into this folder can actually automatically inherit some of that metadata. So if you have maybe a client ID number that you want to give to a document set, anytime you upload something to that document, say it's a contract, that client ID would automatically get inherited there. And then if you needed to search and do some refinement to find all of the documents related to that client, that would be much easier to do. And then a quick note about document sets. The views in the libraries will not work the way that you want them to. I don't want to get into too much specifics here because it would be a rabbit hole to go down, but I recommend that you if you are going to use document sets, that you play around with the views, the view of the library, and then see how that changes when you go into the document set itself, just so that you can plan for that user experience. This is the document set settings screen. Just wanted to give you a quick example of how all this kind of works together. Here you have all of the content types on the site that you have available to you, and you can add those over here. So you could add in, maybe a picture and a rich media asset if you wanted people to upload a bunch of different types of documents here. You can choose your default content type, and you can also assign certain columns. So these would be the columns that are shared across, pushed down to documents that are part of this document set. So just a few of the things that you can do. So again, the building blocks of taxonomy in SharePoint are site columns, the term store and manage metadata, content types, and document sets. And things that are closely related to taxonomy in SharePoint and directly impacted by decisions that you make are navigation and site structure. A quick note on site structure is SharePoint search actually will automatically start to rank documents by the site structure. So if you have a site structure that is very deep, so you have a top site and a subsite and several subsites below that, documents down at that lowest level are prioritized less than documents at the second level or the third level. So that's one thing to keep in mind as you start developing intranets or team sites and you're trying to incorporate search. Your site structure actually has a very significant impact on search and certain other aspects of SharePoint, and a lot of that can be driven, or a lot of decisions that you think you need to make for the navigation. Actually, maybe there's a way that you can work around that. Navigation can be pretty flexible. Site structure is a bit more inflexible. And then again, all of this ties into search, and one related concept with search is keywords. I won't be diving too much into keywords, but really it's the way to help correct search. So if certain users are always looking for a document using a certain term, you can actually tell SharePoint, oh, that term actually means this, and kind of help direct people down the path that you think would be most beneficial to them. So at this point, you may be thinking, how can I do all this? Okay, I understand site columns, I get content types. How can I do all this on my own? So the first step that I would recommend would be just taking a broad look at categorizing your data. I started off with that example of the animal kingdom and how we define, how we would describe a black bear for a reason. It's start as broad as you can and just try to see what chunks you can kind of break off. Maybe there are certain departments or certain swaths of data that just are not needed in an intranet. Maybe you just don't need to concern yourself with them as far as the taxonomy implementation, and that will be beneficial to really define what is in scope and what is outside of scope, and then you can begin narrowing down those categorizations. I recommend just trying to figure out all of the useful ways to describe something. Just because you can use certain terms doesn't necessarily mean that will be useful to users later on. So it doesn't have to be every single descriptor that you can think of. Finding the right amount of information that you want to tag your documents with is key. If you have too much data, it's either white noise, users are just inundated with too much information, or another risk is that the users that are responsible for inputting this data just won't do it, or they'll do it wrong because you're asking too much information from them. And then I like to recommend looking for similarities and differences. So as I mentioned, you could think of a finance expense form as the same form, but it could also be something different if it's been submitted or if it's been approved. So really try to figure out what makes each document distinct, and maybe if you want to just be as broad as saying something like, okay, this is where all of our procedures are, that's one approach. But if you wanted to maybe break up procedures by department, that would be another approach. So these are just different things that I recommend looking at and considering when you're trying to work on a taxonomy by yourself. And then consider use cases for roles working with data. You don't necessarily have to send all of your users to document libraries. Maybe you want to have a nice presentation page where you provide some information and some context around the documents that they're looking at. But you also have people that are responsible for updating that content and maintaining it. So just consider each of these different roles and who will be working with it, and again, you don't want to ask people to input too much information, but you also just want to have as much information as possible to be useful for people searching for that content that aren't necessarily familiar with it on a day-to-day basis. So finally, unstructured data is everywhere. I think it's pretty common for people to have stacks of paper on their desk or a giant folder, documents folder in their computer. I like to actually take a look at these when I start engaging with a new client. I find folder structures to be very useful. They provide insights into how the people that are actually working with the information categorize the data for themselves. I think that's always a great point to start at. And then I like to kind of hone in on what do each of these folders represent. You know, maybe you have a folder for year or month. You know, those could potentially be metadata tags that we use. And I find it very useful to have tools and visualizations that help users understand what you're working towards. A lot of this can be very nebulous. If they're not familiar with it, I actually like to do a brief Taxonomy 101, much like what I did in the first part of this presentation. Just to kind of help people start thinking about what you're working towards and why this is important. And then finally, taking an hour or two to set up a proof of concept based off of that kind of initial review with users can provide talking points, and it can make things a little more concrete and really drive concepts home. And this is just a quick example of the actual SharePoint term set export and import file, and it kind of, I included it just to give you an idea of how SharePoint looks at it, where you can define different columns and how they are related and how they kind of expand the concept of how cities and counties are related to states, and that's all just kind of a concrete example of taxonomy. So that is everything, Julia.
Okay, great. Please insert your questions in the question window and we will get to those. We did have a question about the recording. We will be sending out the recording link as well as the slides from today to all the attendees. We'll give 1 or 2 more minutes for more questions. All right, I think that's it for today. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Josh, for the great presentation. Oh, we just got one in, sorry. Can you show an actual example of what it looks like in SharePoint? I'm not sure if you're able to share that today, Josh.
Yeah, probably not today, but I'm sure if you did a Google search, you could find some screenshots, or you can email me, and I'd be happy to provide you with some examples.
Okay, great. Chris, we will follow up with you about that. And we're getting some comments about how great the overview was and how great the presentation was, Josh. So thank you for presenting today. Thank you everyone for attending, and we will see you in a couple weeks. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.